finishes up, setting everything up. We're live, I think. Are we live?
Yeah, we're live on YouTube, ChiNdanga Mixtape Radio, YouTube. We're also live Facebook, ChiNdanga Mixtape Radio, Facebook page. And we will be chatting to colleagues who are in the Zoom meeting. And the Zoom meeting is connected to the ChiNdanga Mixtape Radio. So yeah, for all intents and purposes, you are live, colleagues.
Okay, guys, we're live. That's Biko introducing us. I guess it'd be good to know if you can hear us. So maybe David, could you, and Gibson, could you just indicate whether you can hear us, all right? Oh, maybe they can't hear us. There's a chat going on. Maybe it's on the chat. Okay. All right. So we need to turn it. We need to speak louder. Okay. The volume is low, guys.
The volume is low. Maybe use the mic.
Is this mic linked up to the machine or not?
I can pull it out.
All right.
Okay, can we speak in the mic?
Yeah, we can speak into the mic. Can you hear us better now? Okay, great. That's better. All right. So we just have to remind ourselves to speak into these mics. I'm just going to move mine so you can actually see me a little bit. This is the mic. It's a big thing that's in my face. All right. Okay. Right. Shall we get this show rolling then? So I think what was the title we gave this thing?
So welcome guys to ChiNdanga Talks. We are in this episode tracing the footprints of the past in contemporary politics, contemporary Zimbabwean politics.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so we're narrowing down to Zim. Our panelists for this conversation, welcome to Cynthia Chigwenya, Professor Root Selector, Used Fontaine. Welcome David Moore, Gibson Nube, and I'm happy we have other colleagues who have joined in on the Zoom. That's Zenzo Moyo and Tafadzwa M, right? Takudzwa M, welcome. You guys can just keep going. Like we said, we're gonna start by basically having you guys talk about the work you are currently doing. Cynthia, you might want to take a lead on that. And then Prof, David, you come through. Gibson, you come through. And then maybe Takudwa and Zenzo pick your brains a little. And then I come back. And then we move to the next floor like that. Cynthia, over to you.
Thank you very much. And thanks for having us. So as they introduced, my name is Cynthia Chigwenya. I am a research scholar at the South African Institute of International Affairs, which is SIA, and I'm also a scholar of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. But my research interests are in post-conflict reconstruction and post-conflict development. And how I started this, I think it was mainly because I interacted with cases of the Rwandan genocide. So my first trip to Kigali was in 2017. I got to tour the Kigali Memorial Site, and as I was doing that research, I remembered that there's a similar incident that happened in Zimbabwe. So post 2017, I then started doing research on the Burundi massacres, and I was just really surprised and wowed by the amount of information that I came across and the amount of information that I thought I knew but didn't know. So that's what sparked my interest. And then moving to 2019, I then did research being supervised by Professor David Moore at the UJ Development Studies faculty.
Not so united.
UJ Development Studies. And yes, that's how I got to get into this. So do you want to take it from here?
Yeah, okay. So my name is Joost Fontaine. I'm a professor in anthropology at UJ, but also I wear other hats like Professor Justin, the
Root selector.
Root selector, yes. But I've been working on and in Zimbabwe for 20 years, and I'm currently working on a book that I'm calling The Politics of the Dead. And I think there's a big overlap with Cynthia's work here, because what I'm looking at is how bodies and bones do things in Zimbabwe, and in particular in Zimbabwean politics. So it links in with the politics of commemoration and with the kind of questions around post-conflict reconstruction. But I'm also, half the book is also about other kinds of remnants of the past. So not just bones and bodies, but also spirits, unhappy spirits, ngozi spirits, ancestral spirits, but also rumors and the politics of rumors. Now I could talk about this book forever, but I won't bore you with it all. It will probably come out in drips and drabs in this conversation. But one of the key things that we were just talking about before we went online, Cynthia and I, was about the politics of uncertainty and the way in which this works around death. And there are many ways in which this works, but I think it's a sort of central aspect of what we could call Mugabeism, the way in which he always played this duplicitous role where he's putting forward certain narratives, but he's also performing power at the same time. And one of the questions that I'm interested to explore in this conversation is the way in which the new regime under Mnangagwa has continued this kind of politics, but also changed it. And the question is, does he play it better than Mugabe or worse? I think he's not quite as refined as Mugabe. Mugabe was smarter than Mnangagwa. But I also think that there are some aspects of it that look very different now, and that's something we can talk about. But I think I should hand over to one of our speakers who are online. Gibson, would you like to tell us briefly about your work? You'll have to unmute yourself.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I work at the University of Zimbabwe in the Department of Foreign Languages, and I'm trained in literary studies. And my research lies at the intersection of literary, gender, and cultural studies. My most recent work has been examining the place of women in Zimbabwean politics, and I've been interested in how women politicians negotiate the political space, which is largely male-dominated, misogynistic, and sexist. I'm currently working on a series of papers that are examining the representations of Gukurahundi in Zimbabwean literary works. So going beyond an analysis of the most known novels like Stone Virgins by the late Yvonne Vera, Running with Mother by Christopher Mnanazi, and more recently House of Song by Novia was a Chuma. I'm presently interested in examining novels which have been written in isiNdebele language. I'm focusing on one hand on how isiNdebele is used to mediate the traumas of Gukurahundi, and on the other hand, I'm also looking at how these literary texts create alternative spaces for the marginalized and often forgotten stories on Gukurahundi. Yes, so basically that's what I'm currently working on at the moment.
Thank you, Gibson. And I recommend everybody to go and read the links to the two articles that Gibson wrote in the conversation, which are really nice pieces and really address some of those things really well. And I've got some questions for you, but I guess we should ask David now to come in and introduce his work. I know David is finishing a book on the coup. David is also known as the Professor of Obvious Truths, but I won't say anything more than that. David.
Hi. I don't know, should I put the video on? I guess it's not important. This is a radio show. I'm very pleased to be on what some could say would be a virtual reincarnation of the Book Cafe, which I understand Biko has had experience with and at. And many of our mutual friends have been contacted about this, but I guess they're busy doing other things up in Brexit land. And actually, it was Paul Brickhill who was the guy who started up the Book Cafe, who was one of the very first people I ever met in Harare in a grassroots bookstore in 1984. And he was introduced to me by a philosophy professor who had taught philosophy at UZ. Anyway, so that goes back quite a ways. And I guess what I'm writing about, and maybe it's bad luck to be talking about what I'm just trying to revise, which is supposed to be finished by the middle of October. But anyway, I think the idea of uncertainty that Joost was talking about is what the book I'm writing is about. It started out to be a book about the coup, and then when it became apparent that Robert Mugabe was going to die soon, in about July of last year, we decided to change it to be a book about Mugabe's legacy, coups, conspiracies, and the conceits of power. And I think certainly what Robert Mugabe has created, or perhaps reinvented is the best way to put it, because I think as Joost's work would show, there is just so much uncertainty, so many rumors, so many factions and political, social and cultural divisions and tensions in Zimbabwean life that Mugabe didn't invent them, but he juggled them and balanced them. And it's my unhappy prediction, which I hope doesn't come true, is that he's the only guy who could do that in ZANU-PF. And I think Joost was sort of saying that Emerson Mnangagwa is not as good at it as Mugabe was. And another connection I have, I think, with grassroots books and Biko is, as Joost was telling me, you guys knew Zino Mashingura quite well, aka Wilfred Mahanda, who actually Paul introduced me to some of his comrades, and I think by '86 I was writing letters to Zino, who was in Germany, on a scholarship that I think Edgar Takeri and Ibo Mandaza organized, and he got in on it because it was very dangerous for him to live in Zimbabwe at the time. Why was it dangerous for him to live in Zimbabwe? Well, in the mid-1970s, Zino was the de facto intellectual ideological leader of a group within ZANLA, within the army, that in the camps in Mozambique, which started a unified army called ZIPA, Zimbabwe People's Army. And Robert Mugabe felt that was going to be a big threat to him, so he and Samora Machel threw them all into prison. So this gives a very, this is my sort of starting point into Zimbabwean politics, is really having many, many long conversations with Zino and his comrades, who experienced firsthand the way Mugabe dealt with dissent, and that was to get rid of it. So that's where I start from.
Tracing, the footprints of Zimbabwean history and linking it to contemporary affairs, I was thinking if from the offset you had parties like ZIPA not getting a chance at the first democratic election, then we have seen this reincarnating in the elections that followed. So it really shouldn't somewhat come as a surprise, because it's something that has been happening. It's just that now it's happening at a more significant pace, and people are drawn to it, but it's something that has been prevalent within Zim politics.
Sure, and of course, David would know this better than anyone, as I imagine with Judith. The Vashandi thing wasn't the first thing, right? Vashandi, there were various rebellions and internal schisms long before Vashandi, and also in ZAPU. So I guess the question that might emerge from that is, are we kind of bound to reinvent the wheel here? What happens to the alternative possibilities that those moments generate and then are squashed? Do they ever come back into the scene? Is there ever going to be a possibility for something like the possibilities that Machingura and the Vashandis were trying to create, a much more Marxist line? Is there ever space for those unfinished pasts, those uncompleted, unrealized futures to re-emerge? That's the question that I would have. Or are they just gone and lost to posterity?
My take would be on, based on Western trends, you cannot silence an opposition no matter how much you try to. You might be able to excel at that very moment, but opposition is bound to re-emerge at some point. So it's the inevitable.
Sure, sure. I wonder whether the opposition will learn from those old areas. I'm not sure that the last 20 years, the opposition parties have learned a lot, but how much are they reinventing the wheel? Maybe we should ask Gibson. What do you think, Gibson?
Well, for me, think about the kind of work that I'm doing at the moment on Kukuro Hundi. It's interesting how the past continues to raise head in the present. And I'm thinking particularly in the very recent past, well, since the coup, the way discussions on Kukuro Hundi have been re-emerging, like especially when Mnangagwa took over the office as president, when Mugabe passed away, and most recently when Prince Shiri died as well, I think. There have been discussions on how the past is not really past, and how there's need to re-engage with it, and need to open up discussions on this part of Zimbabwe's history.
Yeah.
But just to pick you on what you have suggested, by need to discuss and reopen up, whose mandate is it? Because who's supposed to open up, because it's the same government that has been in power. So do we then expect the same government to open up, or do we expect the civil society to open up? And if we're expecting the civil society, is it then strong enough to stand against a system that has been in place for long?
Yeah, and I agree with you actually. And I was in Zimbabwe just before the lockdown, trying to follow up what's been going on since Mnangagwa made his announcement last year about trying to kind of resolve the Kukuhundi issue as if it's, like dirty washing up that needs to be done, as if it's that simple. And actually, what I realized talking to people in Matabeleland is that actually ZANU-PF is much more sophisticated when it comes to dealing with history than anybody else. I mean, the way in which they engaged publicly with the Bulawayo Collective and then actually subverted the Bulawayo Collective and split it and co-opted some members of it and actually used that as a mechanism for ignoring so many other prominent players. And that so much so that the suspicion is, what they really want to do with Gugundi is make a big splash, do a couple of high-profile exhumations, and then say, this is done and dusted, let's move on, which is obviously not going to really deal with that issue. And to me, that reminds me that ZANU-PF is much more sophisticated in playing the politics of history than anybody else. And that's because they've been playing it for a long time. I'm wondering if David would want to come in at this moment.
Yes, I was just looking on my WhatsApp to see the messages that we exchanged yesterday, used and some other people, and I've forgotten the name of that guy who put the thing out on the conversation.com a couple of days ago about how even Kukuruhundi it looks like it was a lot worse than we thought. And I think we are, look, he was a policeman and witnessed some of these things. And we have Godfrey at the university, at the Saul Platley University in Kimberley, writing excellent historical and more contemporary material about life as a soldier, life as soldiers in the Congo, for example, in 1998. So there is a space in some sense which is opening up, perhaps as a generational space as young scholars get in there at that level. But I wonder, if we go back again into history and historical anthropology, maybe you might be able to tell us stories about how in the past conflict has been resolved in a sort of political sense or in a cultural sense. I know that Terry Ranger is famous for saying how the spirit mediums and religious figures supposedly united the nation, and that's a nationalist interpretation of history, which a lot of people have debunked. But even, we know, Judy, you're listening, I don't know if you want to talk, but that moment in the 60s when UDI came in and there was resistance across all spheres to that at the university, newspaper journalist Michael Holman. What happened to that moment? I guess that moment became kind of focused on the nationalist movement, and then of course we had the nationalist movement became what it is today. But there were other moments. What about right after 1980? In 1994, South Africa had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission with many faults. But it did at least it's created a permanent opening of that space. Nothing like that has happened in Zimbabwe, except, of course, what Joost was talking about, and there seems to be this ability to manipulate civil society. So and of course, if we look at opposition, the MDC, when it started, was a strong trade union-based movement. Now, with the deindustrialization of modern Zimbabwe, of course, what has happened to trade unions? So what are the social forces that might be behind a new form of opposition or a renewed form of opposition is very unclear. We have seen, of course, after the election in 2018, those protesters shot down. January 2019, many more shot down in a very chaotic form of killings and protest. Some of the chaos might have been because of the factions in the military, which seem to be pulling in different directions these days, some perhaps progressive. What is happening to them?
David,
in the meantime,
can I interrupt there? Because you're covering a huge territory there, and I think I'd like to pick up some of the questions from the earlier comments, and maybe we can ask Judith to come in here and address the specific question that you asked early on, and then I was going to ask Cynthia a little bit about the work she's been doing in Rwanda, because I think it also relates to this question around resolving problematic pasts. So I don't know, Judy, if you want to come in there. Okay, maybe not. Okay.
She says, I could hear David, but no one following.
Oh, I see.
Maybe
Okay,
follow.
all right. Well, okay, Judy, I'm going to ask David to type his more specific question in the chat box for you to see, and I'll come back to you. And I'm going to quickly...
Can I jump in there?
Yeah, sure. Because
So you won't see me, but with radio. But I wanted to attempt and answer David's question. What are the social forces that might just tip the balance there? We did mention Paul Bricchio, the book cafe, and the experiments that came there. I have also noticed that in the narratives put out by the state, when activists are arrested, there is a repeated fear, a pattern of fear. You can see a fear of what happened in Serbia. So whether real or not, the ghost of the Serbian revolution coming to Zimbabwe. There are a number of youngsters who are arrested after coming from a workshop organized by Canvas, Center for Active Nonviolent Action Strategies. I've had an interaction with comrades from Eastern Europe about our festivals. If you know the history of the Exit Festival in Serbia, started as an everyday musical protest, asking Milosevic to go away, exit, and now it's an exit festival in its, I think, 25th year. Art, creativity in this contemporary politics, what has happened before, Owen Maseko, let's bring in also, I think, the creative threads. We might find answers as to which social forces might arise or what elements might have been missing before that could tip the balance. But yeah, that's me on an interruption there.
no, thanks, Pico, and I think you're right, because I think we could argue that attempts to resolve problematic pasts have tended to be very state-dominated, maybe legally dominated, and actually, as Gibson's work already is illustrating, much more work has been done around the question of the Kukuhundi in the art sphere, in the broadest sense, than anywhere else. And then this actually raises all sorts of questions. I mean, Cynthia, you went to Rwanda, and Rwanda has obviously this massive legacy of the genocide to deal with. But in some ways, I always found it quite odd going to Rwanda, because we know that the RPF has, very much like ZANU-PF, has used history and used questions, legacies of victimhood to substantiate its own political legitimacy. And so you could argue that commemoration in Rwanda is also deeply problematic because it's so RPF dominated. So I think it's interesting that ZANU-PF recently has been sending people to Rwanda to try and learn about how the kind of vernacular exhumations and commemorations that they're doing there, and how they could feed into the kind of activities like the Fallen Heroes exhumations. So what did you learn from that experience? Because, you know, like Biko says, that's a state-run program, right? And maybe that's part of the problem.
I think what we would find quite similar in cases of Rwanda and Zimbabwe is the fact that there were atrocities. The major difference in being, in the Rwandan case, you had the victims then gaining victory and then being able to tell their own story and memorialize the genocide in the way that best fits them. In the Zimbabwean case, it's the perpetrators who are still in power, and they are then also coming back to tell the story of the victims. So I think that regardless of who is in power, there is need to do right by the victims, whether it is the government or the government of the victors or the perpetrators. It's an obligation to redress that. At the moment, I've been quite conflicted about the case of Rwanda, and I say this because I did, after finishing my research, I then came across a book by Judy River, In Praise of Blood, and it paints to you what the RPF has done to take the genocide and politicize it and commemorate the genocide, not only as part of redressing the mass killings, but also shaping their own ideology and using it to put to the people and say that if you don't support this regime, then we're going back to that space. So it's where I'm at now, not a good space to be in, because I had 3 years of my career invested into the narrative that the Rwandan government has portrayed, and then at the very end I come across this very changing book. But yeah, that's the...
I mean, I think part of there's two things I would say to that. Part of the problem is, like, it's never very clear who exactly victims are, and victims are often also perpetrators. And I think that's very true in terms of how ZANU-PF plays the language of victimhood. We were victims of Rhodesia terror, and then we were heroes because we liberated ourselves. But they're also clearly perpetrators. And I think ZANU-PF plays with that ambiguity. I think you could say the same thing about RPF. RPF are, you know, they present themselves as victims, but also as heroes. They ended the genocide. But it's also clear that they have been implicated. You know, it is a kind of authoritarian state, Rwanda. And going back to the arts question, I mean, my relationship with Kigali is really on the arts front. And actually, it's quite a pressurized art space. There's a lot of internationals there, but a lot of the internationals there are a little bit too comfortable with the RPF narrative of itself, and so they're actually quite impotent and quite praise singing. And a lot of the artists that I've met who are based in Kigali are very frustrated being in Kigali, and some of them I know have moved to Nairobi just because it's freer, because in Nairobi and other places, or Kampala, there is more space for artists to express themselves without being constrained by a regime like RPF. And in that way, you know, also Owen Maseko, I mean, I was very grateful when I was in Nairobi to be able to organize showing his Gugundi exhibition in Nairobi. And we had a great time there, and he was a very eloquent speaker. Owen Maseko is very shy, but actually when he speaks, he's incredibly articulate. And it really touched on the Nairobians and the Nairobian art scene, because in Nairobi too, they have this legacy of the violence of 2007-8, and extrajudicial killings is a big story. So, you know, these stories are repeated over and over again in different contexts. And artists, sometimes they have space and sometimes they don't. Maybe Gibson can come in here because one of the things that I find interesting is that your reflection on the fact that more has been written about the Gukuhundi in the art sphere than elsewhere. And why is that? Owen Maseko's exhibition aside, there have been all these publications. Gibson, what would you say to that?
I find it quite interesting that there's lots of literary narratives on Gukuhundi, and that these have actually been allowed to be produced in Zimbabwe without any real censorship from the different governments that have ruled Zimbabwe. And what I'm thinking really is that because literature is very exclusive, it's expensive, the government would not be really bothered by what writers are doing. However, if you look at the kind of reaction that Owen Masego's exhibition elicited, that's more forceful. It was more forceful, and he was censored immediately after, even before he could launch his exhibition in Bulawayo. So I think writing might be important in capturing all these memories, but in terms of being a social force that could change the way things are, the way things are done, the way people think at the moment, I think literature might not have that force, unfortunately.
Pico.
Gibson, would you say the same is true for the oral literature or the spoken word culture? I do understand what you're saying regarding the written text. It's been kind of seen as a bourgeois kind of like a form and limited to the middle classes, and we can even have like this kind of debate at NAST. You know, we're protected by academic freedom because you know, when it's in the ivory towers, it doesn't affect the masses, right? The poor. But for example, I know Mlomo Wako Poetry Slam, spoken word activities around the Bulawayo Art Gallery, the underground hip hop scene, as opposed to urban groups, of course, are very strong in Bulawayo. Perhaps music not played on the radio, but definitely an oral culture. What would be your reflection of, you know, the Gukuhundi discourse within the oral literature sphere?
I think that's a great question. Gibson.
Yeah, definitely a great question, I think. I'm wondering what the spoken word does outside of the ivory towers of academia and also this protected underground spaces. Is the spoken word able to achieve any real change outside these very protected spaces? Pico.
Yeah, Pico, do you want to answer that, or should I try and come in there?
No, you guys can please take it up.
I mean, I wonder whether we could also maybe here come back to something that David asked me earlier on, which is about kind of older, maybe cultural, in inverted commas, practices of reconciliation. And because David mentioned that, and actually there has been quite a lot of talk around this recently. I'm thinking here particularly of the whole Ngozi complex. And I know that older anthropologists have sometimes, and more recent scholars that I know, have kind of seen this as, you know, maybe we could do a kind of so-called traditional form of reconciliation through these mechanisms. And I think certainly in the past, and maybe in small scale, we can see how in certain contexts, say if someone's been murdered or someone's died or there's been some kind of crime or something, you know, there are mechanisms whereby redress is sought, right? Quite often through payments. And that sometimes these have manifest themselves in the last 20 years. I can think of examples, people who were killed in political violence, there's a very famous one of, I think, Moses Jokuda, who was killed, who his family refused to bury him. And there are all sorts of accounts in the newspapers of his body in the morgue, you know, and his Ngozi coming back. There are accounts of, you know, the ZANU-PF guys, because he was killed by the son of one of the ZANU-PF governors, and they're going into the morgue to try and force him to be buried, and they're finding Moses Chukula sitting upright on his bench, just kind of scaring the shit out of them. Excuse me for my French. So I think this stuff is happening, and I've also come across a lot of cases of ZANU-PF youth who are involved in violence. There was a case of someone called Biggie, for example, who 2-3 years later is HIV positive from the rape camps, who's being haunted by Ngozi, whose life is in a mess, who's going back to ZANU-PF to try and say, well, help me redress this because I'm being haunted by the violence I've done. And actually quite often those cases, the youth themselves have had very short shrift. ZANU-PF's just said, it's your problem, mate. So I think this discourse and these practices do exist. However, I'm slightly wary of some of the romanticism that exists around these so-called cultural practices, because I've spent a lot of time working with spirit mediums and so on. And one of the arguments I make in the book that I'm trying to finish is about how spirits are always other and are also profoundly uncertain. So when you talk to mediums, they will often say, my life story is predetermined by this spirit that's going to possess me. But I think those narratives themselves are an attempt by the mediums to substantiate their authority as mediums. And that actually their relationship with their spirits is usually one that's much more uncertain, not necessarily benign. Spirits cause loads of problems. And therefore, I'm not so clear, I'm a little bit wary of these kind of slightly romantic stories that kind of suggest we can use the Ngozi complex and the idea and the practice as a form of reconciliation, because I'm not sure that it always works that way. I don't know if, Cynthia, you look like you want to come in there.
Yes, I was going to say that when it comes to traditional mechanisms of redressing Kukurahundi, you're talking about two cultures that are different. So we're speaking of Ngozi, which applies predominantly to the Shona culture.
Sure.
But we're talking about redressing violences and violations that were committed against Ndebele people. So from the get-go, do Ndebele people practice similar customs? Do they have Ngozi-like practice in their culture if we're going to redress this? So by the very initiative of saying we're going to take Ngozi, the spirits, and it suggests or it connotes a very top-down approach, because Ngozi is a Shona cultural practice, and you're trying to impose this on a Ndebele speaking group that you wronged. So if we're going to talk about traditional mechanism, I think most of the literature that I've come across, including Benyera, Mrambadoro, on traditional mechanism, they're referring to Shona practices. That conversation needs to go back to say, what are Ndebele practices of redressing injustices? And then we get it from there, instead of taking Shona practices and trying to impose them on a different group.
Yeah, no, undoubtedly, Cynthia. I mean, that's a hugely important point. I mean, I would go further than that. I would say, can we say that Ngozi practices in Mashingo are the same in the Dande, among the Gorokore or Mitari? Probably not. We need to be very careful around this word like tradition. And obviously, clearly, the Ngozi things that we're talking about here are much more Shona orientated. It would be interesting to find out what more Ndebele orientated practices are, but I'm not an expert on Matabeleland, and actually, I don't know, Gibson, if you're from that part of the world, could you contribute? Would you think that there would be an equivalent, or is it much more complex than we're talking about here?
I don't think I'm quite specialized in that area,
Yeah.
but you do have the imposition of these Shona practices, like Ngozi, even in Matabeleland, so they do speak about them as well.
Yeah, so I mean, again, I think we need to, I think we can all be welcome to alternative mechanisms, other spaces, other forums for talking about this. We should be, I think, a little bit wary about heavy words like traditional or cultural, because they are both politicized, often exclusivist, and of course, they also imply a kind of static thing in something that is not static. And I guess this then leads us to something, and David looks like he's going to come in, so I'm going to ask David to come in a minute. But we could also say, well, maybe we should do something novel, create something new, like the Gacaca courts in Rwanda, or the Truth and Reconciliation in South Africa. But I guess my first response would be neither of those processes have been unproblematic. There's a lot of dissatisfaction with Truth and Reconciliation because it never dealt with economic injustice, for example. And the Gacaca too has been very problematic. David, you look like I can see that you're itching on the side of your seat there, so do you want to come in there?
Yeah, I don't see a hand to raise here. Anyway, maybe you and Bigo don't want to be like teachers or headmasters. Yeah, I think at the end of Fei Chung's book, she does talk about some spirit mediums who were very angry with ZNU-PF for being so violent, and might they even have predicted or suggested that Tonga might meet an untimely death? I'm not sure. But of course, you're right. These traditions are different all over the place, and they get reinvented. And of course, another one is churches,
Yes.
Christian traditions, which are being reinvented like mad. But I'd like to go back to